Hi, everybody. Welcome to our second webinar on database lifecycle management. Last time we talked about what exactly we're shipping, and there was a lot of discussion around traceability and visibility of our database changes in continuous delivery. So we've had a great discussion with our panel and invited them back to continue the discussion. The last webinar was recorded, and that's available from our website. This webinar will be recorded as well, and we'll send a link around after, so you'll have access to the recordings. Today we'll be talking about how to safely manage application and database changes with continuous delivery. Today's webinar is sponsored by the DLM Automation Suite. This suite allows you to track your changes and integrate them into your continuous integration and release management processes. And we have the product manager of the DLM Automation Suite from Redgate here. He'll be on the end to give a 10-minute demo and answer any questions you might have about this suite. So again, today's discussion is on how to safely manage application and database changes with continuous delivery. And we'll go through and introduce our panelists, and then we'll start the discussion. Every attendee is on mute, but you should have an option in your GoToWebinar panel to ask questions. So please ask questions throughout. We'll try to read out the questions throughout the panel discussion, and then we'll also have some time for Q&A at the end. And finally, if you have the time, stay around for the demo of the DLM Automation Suite. So welcome back to our panelists. It was really great talking about database lifecycle management and continuous delivery with you last time. So let's go ahead and reintroduce our panelists. Brian, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Brian Randell. I'm a partner with MCW Technologies. I've been working with databases since I was in high school, and an application on a database isn't too interesting to me, so I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
How long ago was high school?
See the gray hair? We will, let's just say the 70s and 80s were very good to me. Very, very good to me.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to have you back. Grant, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Grant Fritchey. I'm the product evangelist for Redgate Software. I am the scary DBA, and I've been working in this stuff. I started in development, frankly, and still love developers and developing. But now I've been working mainly as a DBA, so I know exactly how to keep developers in line, having been one myself.
We'll see about that later. And Steve, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Welcome, everybody. I'm Steve Jones. I run SQL Server Central, which I founded in 15 years ago, and have been working there ever since. Redgate has hired me as an evangelist, and I work for them now. I've, like Brian, been working with computers since I was in elementary school or middle school, and done a lot of programming and a lot of administration, networking and everything, and fell into the DBA role and spent a lot of years as a DBA in various companies. And now I talk about DBA stuff and talk about Redgate.
So it sounds like you have a lot of experience with that accidental DBA role. And
absolutely.
Great. So again, today we want to talk more about, just continue our discussion from last time and talk about safely managing application and database changes with continuous delivery. But to get started, just in case any of our attendees weren't on the line last time, could we just define what continuous delivery is and how it relates to the database and application? And I'm going to pick on Grant this time to go first.
So what am I doing?
Did Grant go to the beach? Were you at the beach already?
Basically, just setting the scene about what continuous delivery is and how it applies to application and database changes.
Well, I mean, the whole concept is pretty straightforward. It's easy to define. It's rather a lot of work to deliver, and that is the idea is that you are constantly and continually ready for deployments to production. You may or may not be going directly into your production servers, but you are automating your deployments, you are automating your testing, and you are in a position where you are ready to go to production at all times. Well, all times is a big word, but as much as possible with as many releases as possible, you are prepping for production. And you're doing all this through an automated task across all your environments up to, but not necessarily into your production servers. And that's for both databases and application code. In a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
Yeah, sure.
Steve, anything to add to that or expand? Make it a little bit bigger than a nutshell, or?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good definition. To me, it's really, like Grant said, the important point here is not that you are continuously deploying, but that if you have some reason to deploy changes quickly, like we have a patch or a hotfix or anything else, we've got this process and this pipeline set up where we can quickly and smoothly go send changes through to production. Whether we automatically do that or manually do it at the end, but we're sure that all the changes go through the process. We don't have DBAs just connecting to production and going, hey, I'm going to make this change today in Management Studio because something's broken.
Brian, anything to add to that?
I mean, that's pretty much sums it up. I mean, the key point is there's a distinction between continuous delivery and continuous deployment. And delivery is the big picture, right? It's thinking about the end-to-end process, the people, and everything else, whereas deployment is just one little piece. And as Grant said, getting dogmatic on automation to the point of production is you got to do what works for you. The key is you don't want the pipeline to be the inhibitor to the business, right? The ultimate goal here is to serve the business and to get them what they need when they need it. Traditionally, users don't trust us. And I say us, IT, the folks that build stuff, because we're late, we can't get stuff done. And then there's this friction between IT, who manages production, and all the other people that are getting stuff to production, so it's development, testing, etc. And so what we're really trying to think about is make sure it's this nice flow that we have as much as possible automated, that's traceable, and has a well-known set of ways of doing things, and that we can get stuff there when the business wants it. That's the key thing. Some businesses want stuff every couple minutes, right? We see, I think we looked up Amazon at one point. They do updates. They can do updates, every 11 seconds or some crazy number. But we're talking, they may just be changing one little file. That's the way their business runs. Other businesses might say, hey, if we did an update every month, they'd be just out of control, be crazy. They'd have the Hawaiian shirt on. So we really need to think about how that fits into each organization, but that's the key point. What works for you with safety?
So Hawaiian shirts are a part of the process, or?
Absolutely.
If you can wear Hawaiian shirts to work, that just says you got it. It's low key. You can have that cocktail and just feel confident in your process.
So could you talk a little bit more about the process? What is this process of continuous delivery? How do you actually get into a state where you are ready to release, when the business demands it?
So I think Brian had the key there. The automation becomes important, that you've got to have these ways of capturing changes and making sure that they can get to test environments, that I can spin up test environments as I need them, that I can get copies of production so that I can practice deployments, that I can do all of the all the little technical things that need to happen quickly and easily, and that comes from having good process in place. And then you got to have buy-in from people. People have to be willing to follow the process, and the easier it is, the more willing they seem to be.
I mean, you said it. I think if we do any more talks, this will be a theme that we start with every time. People, process, tools, right? You have to have buy-in from the humans doing this. And once again, this starts with moving people forward, but also making people comfortable, right? A lot of people are open to change, but some people adapt quicker than others. DBAs tend to be a little more resistant to some change, and that's because they take it very seriously, at least all the DBAs I've met, take very seriously data integrity and the fact that the database is often the foundation to every other system that runs in production. Database goes down, everybody's down. Everybody's down, business is losing money, right? It's just that cascading effect. And so everybody has to be comfortable, so you got to get that people right, the process. And then, yes, the only successful way to do DevOps and continuous delivery is simply automation. That's what makes it happen.
And on that note, the whole point of automation is that you must have a process first. You can't automate ad hoc, right? You can't automate manual. You can't automate string of, seat of your pants, flying by night, we'll do whatever, hey, it'll all work out in the end. There is no automation there. You can't do that. So, it is people, process, tools, and the focus is on the people, but a lot of what I hear we'll push back on is like, well, we don't need process because it's people first, right? And it's, well, yes and no. It is people first. However, you cannot do automation without the process, so you must define process in order to do automation. And the whole idea of process is that your process leads to safety. The process is what sets it up so that you're protecting your production environments. Because frankly, and I'm speaking just for myself and speaking just for me, you let me loose on production without a good process in place, I'll break stuff. And it's not, an intentional thing. It's just, I'm a bit of a screw up. So I like to have those processes in place to ensure that what I'm doing is tested, validated, that I'm protecting against me more than I'm protecting against other people.
So could you expand a little bit more on what processes you've seen and how you've seen this working, and what other companies have done, what their process looks like, as maybe to get some ideas of what should be included in the process?
I'd start with CI, start with continuous integration, right at the lowest possible level, right there before, right there at the beginning of development process, you've got continuous integration. Somebody makes a change, you test it, it runs on my machine, it gets checked into source control, and then it goes through an integration process. And the integration process does automated builds, automated testing, and through that, you've got your first layer of protection. You're ensuring that you've got a higher code quality. You're ensuring that you've got, some assurance that what's going to go to production at some point is probably not going to catch the server on fire because it passed CI. That's not the only test. That's not all the tests, but that would be the very first one that you start to build out.
Yeah, I think CI becomes that place to get started. The other thing that I would add is that you need some good collaboration there, because we want to make sure that the development environments, the CI environments, and eventually the production environments are kind of similar. And so, for me, having been a DBA and developer, it becomes really handy when I can be confident that my environments will look the same and that changes propagate, which often means I need infrastructure people to get those environments set up. And as a developer, I hate having them do that, but if they can do it quickly and they can respond to the changes that I want done, when I need them done, then I'm happy to let them manage that stuff. Like I don't manage storage anymore. I stopped doing that over a decade ago, and I just tell somebody I need this chunk of stuff that has to work this fast, and it's their responsibility to have it happen. And I think that's one of those things in setting up this pipeline. We need to make sure those environments are work well, and so those operational folks have to get those set up for us. We were talking earlier before everybody came on that Brian can't use Outlook. Apparently, he's having issues, and it'd be great if infrastructure people could just make that look the same everywhere, right? Make SQL Server look the same, or make Windows look the same, and do it very quickly so that we're happy to let them manage that piece of it, and then I can have a CI process that works well, a QA process that works well.
So both you and Grant mentioned, developers and DBAs. How do they fit into this process? Because, again, what we're talking about here is managing both the application and the database safely as part of this CD process. So you mentioned people, processes, tools, and people come first. So talk a little bit more about developers and DBAs and how they fit.
It's easy. DBAs tell developers what to do.
Oh, now.
Kidding.
It's probably good everybody's on mute. Otherwise, Oh, yeah, we're getting
Thank you,
some
Theo. So,
Good thing you guys are on other sides of the country.
It seems
Oh,
like you might have some people that agree with you, Grant.
yeah.
Well, I think
you know.
it's going to vary from place to place, right? Because some places developers have to make those database changes, absolutely. And I think for the DBA, we have to decide as a DBA on the operational side, managing production more, or the developer producing code, because their view will change a little bit there. But ultimately, you have to coordinate things, right? Developers have to be free to do whatever they want to do. DBAs have to ensure that whatever the developers want to deploy will deploy smoothly and not break production. So there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen.
And it really, a lot of things that impact the way this works is the style of your application, and dare I pull out the legacy word. But depending upon how your system's architected, that's going to affect how you do changes. You don't just suddenly walk into any organization and have continuous delivery. So you start in waves. And so in the beginning, you might actually have a rollout that takes 3 weeks because IT does some changes to the system and they have to do some things manually. It might be because there's actually physical servers being installed or configured and switches and cables. But it might just actually be configuring the virtual servers and they have to do something by hand because they're not automated. Then the same thing to your database. You've got, say, 2 terabytes online, and you're going to make a significant update that requires a schema change. And so your whole validation process is going to take longer. And then you're going to have actually putting new application bits out there. On the other hand, you've started greenfield, you're building a new modern application. The database, can fit on a thumb drive. So I can do an entire backup in a couple of minutes with SSDs on my SAN. And so, a lot of things impact that road to continuous delivery. Telling people what to do is more of an idea of coordination. Who's responsible, and that keyword communication. How are we going to know what's going on, and what is the inhibitor? What is blocking me from doing my job? How am I blocking you from your doing job, and how do we get rid of those impediments?
Have a call coming in. So we talked a little bit about process and people, the communication and coordination key. So what kind of issues have you guys seen when doing continuous delivery, and what should people be aware of when they're trying to set this up to hopefully learn from some of the experiences you guys have and try to avoid those and get a better head start on this?
First, use source control.
Yeah.
Because I worked in a place where we were very agile and developers did all kinds of stuff, but we didn't have the database and source control initially, and that caused us problems because you would make a change on a developer's sandbox, or they would make a change in the development server, and not realize that it needed to move with application changes together because we didn't have any way of tracking the timing of those changes together. So to me, that becomes one of those really important things to start with as well.
If you are looking at databases, code's different, and I really do think it is. But if you are looking at databases, the one thing I would say, your process is going to be different than mine, right? It just is. You've got dependencies I don't have, all kinds of stuff. But if you start from your production server, if you establish here's production, it's online, it's not on fire. How can we keep it online and not on fire? Okay, well, we need to do these 3 things. Awesome. So now if we have to do these 3 things, let's develop towards this point and then work backwards from production so that you arrive at that place where you're protecting your production servers. You can still do automation. You can still do all kinds of stuff. You can still give power and ability to your developers so that they can run fast, and you want to. That should be one of your goals, is to make developers work as fast as possible. But your other goal is protecting your production server. So if you approach your methodology of deployment backwards from your production server, putting protections in place and then figuring out what you have to do to make everything else work, that does make things easier, and it'll give you, as a DBA, it'll give you a lot more peace of mind.
And don't you also think that there are different changes that you make to production there's different scales or things. For example, modifying a store procedure versus modifying a table definition have completely different levels of scope. And I think it's important to understand, because that's the other thing is developers often think, I'm going to make these changes. Here's all the stuff I need done, and it encompasses all these different levels of risk depending on what you're doing. And that's another thing is defining the risk of a change. And once again, maturity of the application, maturity of the database will often do that, because a lot of organizations, schemas can tend to get more stable over time, right? They tend to
maybe.
Well, I mean, overall,
it can. Right? It just.
The core small in a schema, though, right?
Right. Yeah. You tend to do less drastic things like, let's go take this table of 500 million records of customer transactions. We're going to decide to normalize this column.
Right.
Right. Those things aren't as common as opposed to the dynamic change of building the application the first time. But once again, there's a scope and a scale of making changes that developers often don't. They just look, I'm changing the database. Hey, right. I need this done. My app needs this change. And so understanding that and letting people know, and that comes all the way back to that traceability of defining what is this feature, how does it affect the overall system, and how do we do it safely, right? How do we do it in a layered approach?
Right. Danny Cook is asking the question. He says, assuming you're using source control, isn't it best practices to push DB changes from source control? If yes, what is typical workflow from development changes making their way to production? Well, I mean, first off, there is no typical.
Yeah.
But if you should put all your changes in source control, absolutely. That should just be a beginning point. Just as application developers put all their changes in source control, the database should be there too. And then the other thing you then start from that point is you have to work off the principle of if it's not in source control, it doesn't exist. And that's an actual easy one for developers because they're used to that concept. But it's a hard one for DBAs because they're going to go, well, look, there it is. It's in the database. I can see it. And you go, no, wait, watch this. Let me run the automated build. And, hey, that thing you just did, it's gone because I blew it away. So you have to work out a source control as what's that word? Oh, yeah, source.
Yeah.
Well, I think, and you brought up something interesting there is, in Danny's question, in the small, right, if we go way back machine, let's go to the late 90s, and we think about early versions of SQL Server where we just had SSMS, and the way we did, any type of version control was I went and saved off my scripts, and dumped them to .SQL files, right? That was me feeling good that I did that before I made a change, right? And fast forward now, we've got all these tools and stuff to do it, but it comes down to that root of some, DBAs thinking of the small is, as long as I've made a backup copy, that's some kind of source control, so I'm going to move it forward from there. Whereas a large-scale integration process, when you start adding the application onto it, means having to go to these various intermediate environments first. So in Danny's question, we're not going to go straight from source control typically to a production database. We're going to go to some type of, hopefully, automation tool. Right? Now, granted, you might not have the but at least you're going to have a distinction of, here are the changes, these are change scripts, that are then going to go through some kind of validation before I put them in, right? So I think we generally want to think of some intermediate process between source control and the database, yes? Or am I wrong?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think one of those things in terms of typical is that you need a way of pulling those scripts out of source control and deploying them to other environments. So whether that's some sort of state-based approach like SQL compare uses where I look at, two store procedures and I figure out what's different and deploy it, or what's the alter statement for a table, or, I'm just storing migrational scripts in source control that says, here's an alter statement, here's another alter statement, and I'm going to run those in some way. I need some tool, and I use tool loosely, but it needs to be a repeatable way to pull that stuff out of source control. And I think a lot of people are really good at pushing stuff into source control and never figuring out how to get that out and just take certain changes and move them to another environment, right? So whether that's a branch or, something like SQL compare, whatever you want to use, you need some way to do that.
So we also got a question from Mark, who, is a DBA, so not coming from the developer side. So a lot of this is completely new to people that have been mostly on the database side. So I guess he's mentioning starting with CI, and is TFS a tool he can use to play with CI and try and implement DLM? Or it can
yes.
expand on CI from a database perspective, somebody that's never done source control or continuous integration before.
Right, so let's cover a couple of concepts here. So just a real quick refresher. When we talk CI, continuous integration, we're talking about the concept that something goes into some kind of version control repository. TFS is an example of a product that supports version control. It supports two types, but the point is it supports version control. Once it's in there, once it goes in, that causation, this commit, this putting data into source control and saying, okay, now I've made a change, causes something in the system to cause what's known as a build. We generally call these team builds, or a shared build that runs on typically a dedicated build server that's able to take the data out of source control, this change, and run it through a build process. So source code, if it's C#, I put it in, the code gets pulled out with the rest of the code and it's compiled. That's part of the build process. For databases, it's often we pull out the scripts and we go through and generate some kind of deployment script. And then what we tend to do is find a way to test it or to validate it, and those are generally known as smoke tests. We want them to be quick, and we generally want them to be focused on the change we made. So we typically do what are called unit tests, but the bottom line is any type of automated test that's quick and efficient is what we want to do as part of that process. So that's kind of the quick summary. So yes, you can do CI with TFS. Team Foundation Server comes with a build component and has all the pieces necessary to set that up.
And there's other tools out there like TeamCity that has a free version, Jenkins. There's even hosted CI systems as well now. So we have another question about how to keep database changes in sync with application changes. So again, what we're talking about is managing the application and databases changes together as part of the continuous delivery, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a streamlined process for your application and a manual process for your database. So how do you keep your database and application changes in sync as part of this process?
Well, so for me, I've typically tried to get database changes pushed out ahead of time. So when I've worked in agile environments, typically we've released every week or 2 weeks, and that includes database changes. And often what we try to do is release a database change 1 week, let it stabilize, and release the application change that takes advantage of it the next week. That requires some good architecture in your software. You can't, do things like select star. You have to be able to think ahead in terms of having your application be forward compatible with database changes. But that's how I've done it. Now, if you can't do that, you have to coordinate things. I mean, there's no magic way that tells an application that, this store procedure change or this column change exists in the database.
It does go all back to communication, and the whole thing is that, and this actually came up in a couple of the questions, is that the source control becomes a communication mechanism. The whole idea of source control is communication. I made this change, you made that change. That's a fundamental aspect of source control. And so the coordination and synchronization between what's going on in the database and what's going on in the application code won't always be, may not ever be, but it should be communicating through that source control system, whether it's labels, whether it's branches, some combination of both. You should be able to know that version 3.1.2 of the app is version 3.1.2 of the database.
So Dan Jones brings up a good question. Steve, you were talking a little bit about releasing the database before. Do you foresee a time when we'll have the concept of feature toggles, switches in the data tier as we do in the app tier? So maybe if you could explain feature toggles first. I've also heard them referred to as feature flags, and how that works in the application, and what kind of impact that has on the database.
Yeah, so to me, at least in the application side, feature toggles have been often settings in the configuration file or even in the menu system that allow things to work or not work. So I may have some type of form that works with, say, an orders table that has country codes on it, but in the past I haven't had that working. So I added country codes to my order tables. I added some type of lookup table, and then at some point we turned that on in the application so that users, when they do an order, will see countries as an option, as an example. In the data tier, that's tough to do. There is the possibility of using a stored procedure that calls other stored procedures, so you version those stored procedures with different levels of features, but administratively and maintenance-wise, that gets to be really complex. Now, if Dan would go back to Microsoft and give us the ability to see two different versions of the table at two different times, and we could turn that on and off, that would be fantastic, Dan. We would love to have that ability. But right now, there's not a good way to do that. You can play with views a little bit, but I think the complexity for us humans as developers gets too fast too quickly, and I'm not sure we'll see that in the database anytime soon. I'm not sure how you would handle data that way either. If I had a version of the table that had 5 columns and a version of the table that had 6 columns, and the application could see that 2 different ways, what do I do with that data in the 6th column? If I've turned it off and there's a computed column or constraint or something else. I'm not sure I'll see that in the data tier anytime soon.
Well, you can if you go like with an unstructured storage, NoSQL type thing, where you just put in whatever you want, and that's great. But then what happens to that is the downstream systems still have to consume things, and so what you'll find is that for data collection you can just do anything, and it's great. But then for the reporting systems and any other kind of management systems, they still have to have knowledge and structure around the data coming out, and when you've got as you say, extra or missing columns, it all hell breaks loose.
It doesn't work well, right? Because either you're outer joining lots of stuff together, right? This outer to this, outer to this, outer to this, or you're doing some kind of weird coalesce stuff all the time. Right. And I agree, it's a wreck in NoSQL for that reason when you change schema.
So you mentioned NoSQL. I also have a question about any experiences with Entity Framework, Code First.
Come on, Brian.
How that works with this?
So this is a.
Or maybe this should
I'm
be
going to do this politely.
A nutshell version.
So I'm not a fan of Code First, and here's the reason. It's typically done because developers don't want to have a solid understanding of the database and how you define a database schema and how a database works. I see developers who I can quote Don Box, Mr. Calm as Love, and I remember him joking with me in the early 90s when I started Developmentor that, just the database just persistence, right? In other words, it's this opaque thing, right? Now, Don was yanking my chain. In fact, then Don proceeded to learn as much as I do about databases in a couple months, it felt like, and he started working with, at the time, OLADB. So Don has great respect for databases. He was yanking my chain. But my point is, what I often find is developers coming up they know about all the app stuff. They know how to do JavaScript. They know how to make things look interesting. But when they get to the database, that's just some place I store the bits, right? It's a serialization mechanism. And by using Code First, they're not always thinking about how things can be defined efficiently in a database, and where stored procedures, as an example, or table value functions, all sorts of great things, can make the application sing at a central level. And so what I tend to find with people doing Code First is it's because they don't understand how to use database tools, they don't understand the database they're using, and they don't know how to do it effectively. I've occasionally heard as an excuse of, well, we're trying to support multiple databases. That was a hot thing in the late 90s. We're going to write a front end that supports every backend database. We don't do that. People, you build things that are optimized for that backend and take advantage of the thing that's cost you possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars of licenses, let alone the millions of dollars in hardware you're using. So I'm not a fan of Code First. I think it's great for prototyping. I think it demos well. But I start at the database. I sit down and do my normalization. I work with my database folks, my DBAs, and my application developers, and build a good, strong data model. And from there, then I build my object layer and stuff on top of that. So that's.
I've worked on both. I've worked on Code First applications. I've worked with people doing Entity Framework. Worked with people doing Hibernate, and it really is a down to communication and coordination. And the team that did all Code First with no coordination and zero communication to the DBA team failed, frankly. they failed. The team that came to me and said, look, we want to do this, can you help us? I said, yeah, heck yeah, let me help you. And so we succeeded. We delivered an application that they were able to use Entity Framework. It worked really well. I'm a fan of Entity Framework because of my experience with that one team. But what I do see is that a lot of people look upon it as a way to not communicate with their DBA team, and frankly, they dig holes. And the really interesting thing about Code First that I've seen is that it actually works really, really well, variations on the word well, for 1.0. It's as soon as you say, okay, 1.1, and suddenly things start to break down really fast. And that's been the bigger issue for me is that 1.1 release it's not so good at.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. The thing I'll say is that I don't mind the code first approach if developers are willing to redo lots of work, because they're going to churn and try different things, and it's really kind of an experimental phase, like Grant says, for 1.0. And they have to allow that if they, build these objects not in a parent-child schema, or they're not normalized something else, that the DBA might want to twist those and make them work better, which means they're going to have to then twist what they're doing in any framework or any ORM to fit what's in the database, because you can do that, but they have to redo some of that work. And so if the developers aren't willing to redo their work to make it work better, right? If they want to just create an object class and throw it away and move on to the next thing, then it really fails, like Grant says, once you go past the 1.0 point.
So we had an interesting question from Matt. For database objects, what should be your system of record, source control or the production database?
Yes.
Yes.
That was my first response too. Yes.
Okay, next question. But more importantly, how do you handle it when those two get out of sync? So if both source control and your production database are your system of record, are your version of the truth,
what do you do? So I actually wrote about this recently, but I want to let Grant handle it, because I kind of learned this from Grant, that production and VCS are the system of record.
Okay, I don't know what I said, so you're going to have to correct me after I say what I said. Hey, now, the fact is that source control is going to almost immediately go out of sync with production, right? Because you're branching, you're making changes, you're checking stuff in and out, you're constantly in flow in source control. But hopefully you have a known state at which point they were in sync, that that this label or this branch of your source control system does coordinate with a given release of your production server. Now at 3 a.m. My phone goes off, which doesn't happen anymore. I love my new job. At 3 a.m. my phone goes off. I get up. I've got to do something to the production server to get it back online. I am not going to go to my source control system, check stuff out of source control, make changes, check it back into source control. Not at 3 a.m. It's just not going to happen. At 3 a.m. I'm going to go into production. I'm going to make the change I have to make damn sure it works, and go back to sleep, because that's what's important. Is I go back to sleep. No, I've got to protect. I got to protect the production server first, but then second, I want to go back to sleep.
Yes.
Then in the morning, I should go back to my source control system, check out that branch, make that change. But you know what? It doesn't happen, and that's a little thing we call drift, and we'll actually be talking about that later. It's kind of funny the question came up. And you've got to have a mechanism in place. It actually brings in an interesting point. Just make this real quick, and then I'll shut up. We talk about a pipeline to production, like dev, test, production, dev, test, production. But you got to think of it, you shouldn't think of it as a pipeline. You got to think of it as a circle, because you're going to be constantly getting bugs, changes that have to go back in, and it's got to go as a complete cycle. Your bug fixes and all this stuff are not separate from your development and deployment mechanisms. They're a part of your development and deployment mechanisms. And so tracking bugs, tracking feature requests, tracking all of this within this same system is a vital part of what you do, and that's part of how you make sure that you eliminate that disparity between the two. I'll shut up.
There you go. Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
Is that what you remembered, Steve?
Well, it's similar. I mean, yeah, for the most part, right? Because production is always a source of record, right? That's what we use. I mean, that's the truth, absolutely, because that is code that is running and doing work in some way. Source control is a system of record, right? At some point in time, those are in sync, but as Grant said, they're never perfectly in sync in time, because by the time a change arrives in production, I've probably moved on in development. But that's why I have source control, because I need source control is a series of points of time where I know what the code looks like. And one of those points of time is what production looks like right now. One of those points of time is what production looked like last week. And one of those points in time is what production will look like in a month, right? They're always there. And so source control allows me to have all these points of time, which become important for deciding what's going to go to production. Now, when I wake at 3 a.m., I would hope that I have a pipeline or a circle in place where I can say, all right, I've got a bug. Let me create a version of production right now in development, make a hot fix, run that through CI or run that through some kind of testing, run that through a sample deployment, and then throw it in production. And I've been in environments where we could do that, where we kept a pipeline of current production in place all the time based on a branch and source control. And so if we did have a hot fix, we could run it through immediately and deploy it to production and then merge it back into our development area. But certainly, as Grant said, there are times where production will get ahead of development in some ways because of a hot fix, and you have to feed that back through. And that's really a manual process. I mean, and there's no magic doing that, right? You can have tools to make that easier, but you got to decide, I'm moving this change back to development.
I think the way I summarize it is, we always look at production as the source of the truth. What we want to do is start, if you just walk in and you set up this process, you have a database of production. That becomes the source of truth. You document it, and one way we document it is by taking whatever we can and putting it into source control. At that point, there's the source of the truth. They're equal. And then, as we said, moving forward, source control is going to evolve as we make changes in development, and production will evolve to serve the business need. Now, the business need might say that, yes, Grant gets called in the middle of the night, gets his butt out of bed, and fixes production that requires a manual change to the production system that did not go through a release pipeline. That is still the source of truth. What we want to do is make those the exception, not the rule. Right? We don't want to see a huge drift between the two, right? As Steve made a point, right? Source control is a journey, right? It's points in time. It provides you with time travel abilities to go back and see where you've been. So what we want to do is try and keep them in sync as much as possible, knowing that they will have a little bit of drift. It's the amount of drift that we have to determine what's acceptable in our organizations.
So this brings up a good question about branches and source control, and how do you merge two branches?
That's going to have to be for another day, I think.
That's another day. We'll follow up with you.
Branching one day.
We have your email, so we can follow up with you after this, and perhaps that's a future
discussion
webinar.
all by itself.
Yeah, branching is another webinar.
But one of the things we wanted to discuss was really about safety, and if you can give some feedback on either data masking or permissions or locking down environments, and really how to safely manage these changes in a CD process. Because since safety is such a big concern for the production.
From a security standpoint, you've got to remember you've got two diametrically opposing trends. On the production end, you've got legal ramifications to exposure of any data. So the days of, oh, here, give me a copy of production, are coming to an end, because, at least in certain industries, because you cannot give that data out. You can't even give it out in some cases masked. There's some laws around about exactly which piece of data can be exposed and how they can be exposed. So you've got to meet those needs. On the other end, your development team, at least inside their development system, certainly in their sandbox, but probably any kind of dev integration environment, should be able to do anything. And get anything done that they need to do to move forward. So you then have to find the mechanism to meet those two things, and the way I've generally proposed it is that you have a series of of smaller and smaller rings through which you can drive, and that's that you move to CI, it has more security than the dev environment. You move to testing, it has more security than the testing environment. You move to staging, it mirrors closely production, and then you move to production, and it's clamped down hard. But you've got to go through those steps in order to meet the completely diametric needs that you have to supply, and that's to meet legal requirements, jail time legal requirements, right? Not oh, here, we're going to speak with you harshly and wag our fingers. No, you're going to go to prison, and you're going to get a cellmate named Tiny, or you're going to follow these rules, right? So I'm going to follow the rules, but I want to make sure developers can do what they need to do.
Tiny, huh?
Yeah.
That was Timmy.
Tiny Tim. So yeah, definitely a huge concern. Brian, anything that you've
I'm
seen
sorry, I'm lost on Tiny. Yeah, once again, every environment, that tends to be a friction point, I know, with one of the companies I was working with. They had everything really good up until stage, and then everything just kind of dropped off the map because when it got to production, everybody was so afraid of everything. And I think that's a big thing is knowing what really has to occur. What is your due diligence required to protect data, to protect customer information, et cetera, and be in compliance. And oftentimes, I worked with an organization that they fell under bank rules because of the way they provided credit to their customers. And so it totally changed the way we thought about production data. And so when you start thinking about how to manage that, right, it gets to the point where it's like automation is actually your friend, right, is thinking about how we want to get the humans out of it. And make sure that we're protecting the data from a standpoint of make sure it's backed up, but also making sure that the data that's visible to the humans at the raw level, the naked level, not going through the applications, is kept to a minimum.
So we actually have 3 more minutes before we get into our DLM Automation Suite demo with our product manager. So just I wanted to go around with the final thoughts from each of our panelists. I know there are a few unanswered questions. We do have your email address through the registration, so we'll try to follow up and post blogs about any unanswered questions after this. Steve, any kind of final comments on this topic, safely managing application and database changes with CD? What's your takeaway?
I think for me the final takeaway is that you've got to make sure you've got communication and coordination to make this stuff work safely, because we can do all the process automation we want, but if people are subverting the process, then it kind of creates this instability and unsafe environment.
Grant?
Boy, I agree with that. It really is down to communication. I guess I would go back to the one thing, like I said, establishing your process by working backwards from production, protecting your production environment has worked for me in the past. It really is all about finding the way to meet the two needs you have: protect production, make developers fast, and just find that mechanism, find that sweet spot between the two that can satisfy both needs, because you can do it. It's just a lot of work.
I would think one of the big issues that I find is making sure developers have as close as possible a mirror of what production looks like. Now, obviously it doesn't have to have the same amount of memory cores and everything, but often developers are working, this still adage, hey, it worked on my machine, it compiled, ship it, right? And they don't have this intermediate stage where they can bring it all together and say, does it still work? Because that's the other thing is you want to find problems sooner, right? You want to find that, as Graham was saying, those rings. At the developer level, I can do just about anything. That's fine, but I need to know that things still work and that I can prove with some kind of testing. So it's making sure that I can duplicate my production environment as close as possible in dev, so that I can see how things work as a unit, as a complete system, and before I hand it off to the DBA, he looks at my code and says, "Are you crazy? You can't do that in a store procedure." Select star from, God forbid.
Thank you again, everybody. Again, if we didn't get to your questions, we'll try to follow up with you afterwards. And we have some final thoughts after the demo from our product manager, Richard McCaskill, on the DLM Automation Suite. So I'm just going to hand the controls over to him so he can go ahead and do the demo. Richard, are you there?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, guys. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Hi, my name is Richard McCaskill, as you said. I'm product manager here at Redgate, working in DLM Automation, and I'd like to show you a few of the features of the DLM Automation Suite. Now, our tagline is automate your database changes with continuous integration and release management. This demo will focus on the release management part of the continuous integration, continuous delivery process. Now, for this demonstration, we're going to use Octopus Deploy, which does a nice job of separating the concerns of deployment from build and test. I'm just going to bring that up for us here. So what we see here is the main dashboard of Octopus Deploy. So it separates the concerns of deployment from build and test. Why would you want to do that? Well, you may have a requirement to have one team run the stages of build and test, let your developers have full access to Team City, but have a separate team for deployments. So Octopus does help support segregation of duties, which for some can be part of the regulatory landscape that you have to fit into, or maybe just part of release management. You might be deploying from Team City or TFS or another build server, and that's fine. The Redgate tools support that as well. Just a reminder, while I'm talking about the Redgate DLM Automation Suite, it's all about exposing to your build and release server the power and flexibility of the Redgate tooling that's been developed over the last 15 or so years. So it includes the engines for SQL Compare, SQL Data Compare, and several other products as well, plus their command line interfaces for custom implementations. But I'm going to show you one part of it, just the release part, for a relatively simple process. Another reason why to use Octopus Deploy, for me, the winning feature is this dashboard, which lets you know exactly what is in any environment at any given time. Having tried for years to run this kind of thing on a spreadsheet, I know how valuable this can be, just to have it all there at a glance, and it's absolutely the case because Octopus took care of it all. So we're deploying to different environments, and we're going to have a look at the process here. We're going to look at how the process has variables associated with it, which we can use as part of our deployment to customize for different environments. You may have other things that you want to customize between your environments, hopefully only the things you really want to be different, like mapping your database security roles to separate Windows security principles. One of the trickiest things we find in the DLM journey for many people is, as Steve mentioned before, getting their environments aligned, especially if your QA server is actually just the old web server that you are allowed to pick up out of the cupboard. I'm sure a few people recognize that situation. It's only got one disk, so it's not the same as product. Dealing with those environment difficulties is a high priority in getting DLM going. But if you've got the changes that you want to have between the different environments, then Octopus certainly lets you do that. So I'm just going to go back to basics. I'm going to go back to creating a release. Now remember, I've created a NuGet package using the Redgate DLM Automation Suite on Team City. So this isn't part of the demonstration. We're just moving on to the next stage where we're doing the release management part of the story. So I'm creating a release.
And that's actually coming from a build that was from a source control.
That's right. It's been source controlled with the Redgate tools. We use SQL source control on the developer's machine. They committed their changes to the database, and first thing we're going to do is we're going to deploy to a dev integration environment. So they could be working on their own laptops, they could be working sandboxed, and the first thing we'll do is start promoting it through the environments to check through these diminishing circles of what we're going to allow through, that the deployment is safe, that it is what we think it is. and we're going to verify that in different ways for the different environments. In this case, I've got 4 environments, and I'm using a simple process in Octopus, which is the same for each environment except production, where we've got a gated release, meaning that we're going to need to step in and separately approve that release before it actually happens. If we go back to the dashboard, we can see that my release has been successfully deployed to my dev integration environment. And now it's time to promote it up through the environments. Now, I'm going to do what we never would do here and save a bit of time and skip an environment or two. I don't recommend this, but I'm going to promote to production. So let's have a look quickly at what these different steps were. If we go back to the process definition, I've got a simple job to go and get my NuGet package. So I've put that onto my Octopus server NuGet feed from Team City, and that's going to be the same thing that happens in all the different environments. Next, I've got to create database release. If we go and have a look at that, this is Surface. This is a Redgate step template that's made available to Octopus Deploy, and this is really just reaching into that engine, into that Redgate engine to create it's actually PowerShell under the hood. We could run it all at the PowerShell command line, but we want the tight association between the process, the artifacts, and the approval that a release tool is going to give us. And what it's actually, when we say create full database release, what we're really doing is we're taking a snapshot of the source, we're taking a snapshot of the particular target that we're going for at the moment, we're creating a change report, and we're making this available for the next stages. If I go back to the overview of my process, I can see that I've got this production only step, review changes for the deployment, and my final step, which is deploy the database release. So let's go and let's look at the dashboard again. Look at this item that was put into dev integration. It's ready for promotion. And we see that this has got artifacts here that tell us what exactly the change is. So even at this early stage in the pipeline, we can have a look at this changes document, and we can verify that it is what we expected, that the code is exactly what we expected it to be. We've got 2 changes here. We've got 1 changed store procedure. So I just remembered to set no count on early in that. And we've got 1 new user-defined function. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to go back to that Octopus deploy history of the release. I'm going to promote this to production. This is repeating that same process. It's getting that same package. That is the package that has passed our tests in the build server. It's passed, and if we've got T-SQL-T tests, it's passed all those. It's got through all the stages that we've defined on the build server, and it's pushed it up to the NuGet feed on Octopus. Now we'll see here, this has paused now, and I've got a task to review the changes for deployment. So I'm going to assign this to myself. There's a lot more automation, there's a lot more configuration I can do to automatically assign that to a particular person. I'm going to assign that to me. And I'm not going to improve this yet. I want to see those artifacts again. I want to see that those changes were exactly the changes that I expected to see. So let's just have another look at this changes.html. I'm hoping that's going to be the same. And that is the same change for the stored proc and the new user-defined function. So I'm pretty happy with that. And of course, you insert any other change control requirements, sign off, any other extra things that are particular to your environment, the things that are right for your process and for your business. So if I click proceed with that, the record of my intervention there to say that I was happy to release is there for all to see. The record of what artifacts were associated with this release are there for all time. And I have a verified deployment to production. One other thing worth mentioning, an extra piece of protection that the Redgate tooling gives you at this stage, is to protect you from drift during deployment. It has those snapshots of the target states that are created in the create database release step, and it's going to check those again when it does the deployment. So if there has been a hotfix applied in the intervening space, if there's been a new index added to troubleshoot a performance problem in the 3 a.m., it may be that the ops manager said, well, actually, we couldn't release at the exact time we thought we could. We had to run end of day. We had to wait for something else to happen. It could be the DBA was stuck in a meeting, couldn't come out to review the releases. We don't know exactly how long that's going to take. So we need some protection, and Redgate tooling gives you drift protection during deployment. Just to go back to the dashboard briefly, I've got my verified numbered release in production. One other thing I can do, of course, if I want to look at previous releases, if I do need to revert, I've also got numbered package releases for rolling back. So production was 22. If I need to go back to that, I can go back to that. One more point about drift. We heard drift mentioned a few times there. We need protection after drift. Now this would be another demonstration, but in fact the DLM Automation Suite does also include the DLM dashboard, which gives you drift protection after this step, after this deployment into production. Emails you, tells you something's changed, you've got to deal with this, you've got to get it back into the pipeline, or you've got to tighten up your processes. So that's the DLM Automation Suite in use by Octopus Deploy. Say other release management tools can use this. You can use other tools that are multifunction, like TeamCity, like TFS, Jenkins, Bamboo, other automation tools in order to surface that. But what the DLM Automation Suite gives you is access through the interfaces for those products into the Redgate engine, into the tools that are going to really help you lock down that pipeline and protect your database deployment through all stages. Thanks very much for your time. I'm going to hand back to Stephanie now.
Thanks, Richard. So we were talking about safety today, and it was really nice seeing in your demo that you still have that manual intervention step, so DBAs can get involved in the process, review and understand the changes, see exactly what's going to happen before, continuing that deployment, which really helps making sure that the deployment is going to be safe. That about wraps up our time today. I know there's still some questions going in, so again, we'll try to follow up with those afterwards. We'll be sending a link to this recording. If you have any additional questions, please contact us at dlm@redgate.com. There's also more articles, webinars, tools, and download free trials of any of our tools, redgate.com/products/DLM. Also, if you're really interested in any more information and getting hands-on, we have one-day training workshops on source controlling databases, continuous integration for databases, and also automating database deployment. So what Richard showed you today, these are hands-on workshops being offered publicly around the US, UK, and also available on-site for teams of 4 or more. And also we are partnering with certified consultants, certified Redgate consultants, to help with consultancy in this area as well. So please get in touch if you have any questions, and we're looking forward to the next webinar, and we'll be announcing that soon. Thanks again, panelists, for your time. It was great chatting with you again, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.